basically casting a pike fly isn't any different than casting any other fly. One little difference though is that often I'll make a slightly longer stroke than I normally would, simply to help move along this large and wind-resistant fly. The big difference lies in the choice of line and leader, and we'll take a closer look at that now. As far as rods for pike fly fishing goes, you can basically use any rod. I strongly recommend that you use a 7 or an 8 weight or even a heavier rod, because you will be casting big flies, and as far as pike flies go, this isn't even a big fly. And often you'll be dealing with wind, and the heavier the rod you use, the further you can cast. So a relatively heavy rod, 7 or an 8 weight, is definitely an advantage. This happens to be a saltwater rod, which really isn't necessary, but the lifting power that has been built into the bottom section of this rod is also often an advantage when you're pike fishing, because you will eventually catch big and heavy fish, and often they'll run for some structure, and then the lifting power in these saltwater rods is a great advantage, so you can stop the fish. This happens to be an 8-foot rod. And especially when you're casting these relatively heavy lines and big flies, and especially in the wind, I really find that this 8-foot rod compared to a 9-foot rod is an advantage. It's simply easier to cast. But any 9-foot rod will do just as well. I do recommend that you don't use anything longer than a 9-foot rod. So basically you can use any 7 or 8 weight fly rod that you already have. But you will need a specialty fly line. As far as weight forward lines go, most manufacturers today make specialty fly lines that are made specifically for pike fishing or for casting very big flies. The main difference in these lines compared to a standard weight forward line is that the belly is usually shorter and it's a little bit heavier, and it's made with a very steep and powerful front taper that will help you turn over these big flies. Another line choice you can make is using a shooting head. The shooting head has some advantages. You can customize your own line, so you can make it as long or as short as you prefer. And when you're out fishing, you have the advantage of quickly changing your line so that you can go from a floating line to a sinking line. That way you can change tactics in a matter of minutes. If you choose a shooting head as your line when pike fishing, I recommend that you go for a relatively short shooting head. That simply makes casting big flies a lot easier. This happens to be an 8-meter long floating shooting head, and I rarely use shooting heads longer than that when pike fishing. Specialty fly lines and fly rods aside, perhaps the most important part of your setup is your leader. One thing that you will need is a wire trace at the end of your leader, otherwise a pike will simply cut off your fly. I prefer to use some sort of wire. You can use heavy fluorocarbon, but the risk of the pike biting off the fly is larger when you're using fluorocarbon. Wire is definitely the best. Leaders for pike fishing are actually as simple as they can be. The first part of the leader is an approximately 1.5 meter long piece of nylon, at least 0.50 millimeters in diameter, and you can definitely use it heavier as well. Attached to that is a piece of wire that prevents the pike from biting off the fly, and attached to the wire is the fly. So the leader itself is actually very, very simple. I attach the nylon to the fly line with a loop-to-loop connection. Most fly lines today come with a factory-made loop, and with a perfection loop in the nylon, you simply loop-to-loop these two together. As for the wire tippet, if you use a wire that you can tie knots on, you can simply make the exact same connection, 2 perfection loops that you loop together. and at the terminal end, a simple loop knot in the wire attaches the fly.
Wire leaders can curl and often need replacement, typically a few times during a day of fishing. The leader Lars just recommended is a very good solution because it's simple and easily replaceable. There's no need for swivels. Use a multi-strand wire. This makes it easy to tie knots. Tie a perfection loop in one end. You can find the knot online and it's very easy to tie. The fly is attached to the leader with a simple loop knot, like this one. Tie an open knot on the leader, then pull the fly onto it and turn the wire 2 times around itself. Then you guide the wire through the loop and tighten it by pulling from both ends. Another option is to use a snap, but it's very important that it's of good and strong quality. Alternatively to a multi-strand wire is to use a single-strand titanium. It does not bend as much, but it still needs replacement after a few hours of fishing. Never use crimps to make your leaders. The cast can make the titanium very fragile and in risk of breaking while casting. Use a clinch knot instead and twist it 2 or 3 times around itself. Then pull both ends with a plier to tighten the knot. Attach a swivel or small ring in one end and a heavy fly snap in the other.